All right, so this is the beginning of the intro to the topic lecture. So real quick, what do we mean when we say like the topic? Every year, there's a different topic in debate. And so each year, the debate camp, all the debate camps of the season will start with the topic lecture. So each year, the topic is different. And each year, we have to start to preliminarily think about that topic. So if you're in policy debate, there's a lot of things that you have to learn about. You have to learn about the form, what it means to be a debater, how to do debate, which is what Darcell's lecture was. And Darcell referred to this form versus content distinction. Then in policy debate, you have to learn how to debate. You have to learn arguments. So you have to learn how to make arguments that have all the components, like inherency, harm, solvency. For an AF with a plan or with a disadvantage, you'll learn that it's like uniqueness, link, and impact. So there's different formats and forms that we have to learn about how to make arguments, and that's part of debate. And not only just how to make these arguments, but how to be persuasive when we deliver them. So there's a lot of arguments that can be made. There's a lot of evidence that we have. There's a lot of arguments we write down or we accumulate in files that have clash. But then how do we synthesize all of this and choose what arguments need to be made, and not only make those arguments, but make them in a persuasive way? Because even in Zoom world, where debate is done online, it's still a public speaking activity. It's still an oral speech activity. And so you like need to persuade the judge. That's having good arguments and having a persuasive way style is key to the like nailing down the form of being a policy debater. But on the other side of policy debate is learning about the topic, learning about what we debate about. So that's the sort of content. So every year in debate, we have a new topic. And each year, regardless of what the topic is, we weigh the advantage. Debate is about weighing the advantages and disadvantages of implementing a new policy. So there's a resolution that determines the topic. It usually starts with the United States federal government should, but it hasn't throughout all time, but pretty much the last like many decades, the resolution starts with the United States federal government should, but then what the policy is about, like what the topic is about, what the policies are geared towards, like are they geared towards environment? Is it domestic policy? Is it foreign policy? Is it the courts, right? So every year we debate about something different, but the one consistent thing in content is that we're weighing the advantages and disadvantages of United States policies. That's why we call it policy debate. And then then that's sort of what unites us and makes it so that we could pick up, like if we were JV last year and be varsity next year. And there's a lot of the things that we've been doing because of that similarity in form and even similarity in content, that each year we can get better, even though there's a new topic. But each year there's also an opportunity to learn about a new topic and learn about something different. So last year it was criminal justice reform for the high school topic. The college topic and the high school topic are different every year. And so oftentimes the college and high school debate communities, since they're kind of interact with each other, will be getting education on each other's topic too, because high school debaters will watch college debate or college debaters will judge high school debate. But each year or each new debate season, we get a new topic. And that topic sort of frames our discussions and how we approach and research our arguments for that year. So that's sort of the visualization of the form versus content distinction that Darcell had mentioned yesterday in the Intro to Policy Debate lecture. Any questions on that? All right. So this year, every year we have a topic, and there's a resolution that defines the topic itself, but then we usually shorten it. Like there's usually a shortcut name for the resolution. So when we think about it, like B and Darcel were saying they've each been doing debate for like 13 years or something. The first year I came into debate was, I think, actually two of the people in this room, John Lawson and Scott Worrow, recruited me over from the forensics team to the debate team, but the first time I did debate was in 2003. So if you think about, I've done almost 20 debate topics, and more if you count high school and college. But thinking back on those, there's like a 1 or 2 word phrase that you use. So this will probably be called like the water resources topic. But we don't want to just think of it in these broad terms like the water resources topic and say all the debates will just be about water resources, just generally, because the resolution specifically creates limits for how we debate about water resources. So last year we could say like criminal justice reform topic, but there was a list of specifically 3 areas of criminal justice reform: policing, forensic science, and sentencing, right? So that those 3 areas created a limit on criminal justice reform so that the AF wasn't just about like anything related to criminal justice reform. This year, the topic is water resources, but it's not just anything related to water resources. It's specifically that when Darcel had said yesterday, the affirmative has the burden of proof of the resolution. The affirmative has to defend that the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States. So if any of you have watched like Law and Order or anything like that, you might have heard burden of proof used in court too. We take a lot of the same terms that we use, like we have 2 sides and a judge, and we use a lot of the same, like cross-examination, for example, is taken from lawyers. So same thing with burden of proof, burden of rejoinder. It's the affirmative's burden of proof, just like how the prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. The affirmative needs to prove beyond, we don't say beyond a reasonable doubt in debate, but the affirmative needs to prove that has a burden to prove that there's a net benefit to the United States federal government, substantially increasing its protection of water resources in the United States. Meaning that the affirmative proposes a plan that fits under this resolution, and their whole task is to prove that this would be better than the status quo. It would be better if we increased our protection of water resources than if we just didn't do anything. So let's get into the specifics of like let's break down this resolution to see what the terms actually, how they limit us. So let's focus first on water resources. So water resources is a particular term of art in the resolution. Does anybody know or want to take a guess at what I mean when I say term of art? Like that 2 words together, when they're spoken together, encompass a term of art. It's okay if nobody wants to take a stab at it. I basically mean, if you look at the words separately, water and resources, they each have their own definition. But if you take the words together, water resources, then the 2 words together mean something more than just isolating them independently. That's what we mean by term of art. So even like the term, I'm thinking like proper noun. Water resources isn't a proper noun, right? But proper noun itself is a term of art, because it's like noun is one thing and proper is another thing. But when we say proper noun, we don't mean like, oh, the most dignified of the nouns. It's a specific thing. The combination of the words together mean more than just the sum of its part. So water resources are something that we have to look at specifically, instead of just thinking of water and then also thinking of resources. So when we think of protecting water resources, we're not just protecting everything in the water or all water. This topic is not a topic about protecting water. It's a topic about protecting water resources. Does anybody want to give a shot at like trying to explain the difference, or maybe even giving a tentative like definition of what we mean when we say resources versus just saying water? Tony?
Water could conceivably refer to simply the chemical itself, hydrogen, dihydrogen monoxide, to use a term of art, but resources refers to the usable, potable, the usable amounts of water, the actual chemical that a community can use for its own sustenance and for other purposes.
Good. All right, anyone else? All right, that was a great answer. So water itself is just H2O, right? It's a chemical property. Even when we're thinking of water, we talk about it like it's a one thing, like, oh, there's water there, but it's hard to draw boundaries around it. So when we talk about water, we're also talking about bodies of water, usually, not just water itself. But I think that the key word that Tony brought out here was usable, right? So resources are usable for humans. Any other guesses or like things that you're thinking of that would that would set water resources apart from just thinking about water as just like a huge body of water or these little bodies of water? Like specifically what makes what's a water resource? Supplies, good. So things that we would like extract from the water, or even extracting the water itself so that it becomes a supply. Good. So it's no longer just like H2O. Now it's a water supply. So that water's turning a body of water into a water supply source for humans is an example of turning water into a water resource. Good. So both of these are good examples. And when Darcel yesterday had talked about topicality, some of you might not start off, like, for example, in these debates on Saturday, debating about topicality, but even if you don't debate topicality for the first few tournaments, it's still important to think about topicality and how the topic is limited, because that will frame what affirmatives people write on this topic, where the literature is guiding people to write affirmatives, develop advantages, and how we will develop negative responses. So the definition of resource is important, not just for reading topicality and defending against it, but for having an understanding and that predictive power of knowing what the affirmatives on this topic are going to be about. So if we think of the topic as a water topic, we're going to be preparing for a bunch of stuff that isn't really on the topic, because this topic is about water resources. So I pulled a couple definitions that I found just tentatively online. One is from just dictionary.com. Resource being a noun, a source of supply, support, or aid, especially one that can be readily drawn upon when needed, or the collective wealth of a country or its means of producing wealth. So I thought this one was good because we're talking about the United States water resources. And oftentimes resources are divided by territorial sovereignty, nations, states, cities, etc. Who controls the water is determined by territorial boundaries. And then this definition I got from resource refers to all the materials available in our environment, which helps us to satisfy our needs and wants. So I feel like both of these definitions sort of mirror the two definitions that were given to us by Tony and I don't know your first name, whoever was V McIntosh.
Victoria.
What is it?
Victoria.
Victoria. Okay. All right. So good job with those educated guesses. So I did a little diagram here. If we think of all water and then we look at water resources is just a part. It's like a subtopic of thinking about water. So even though this is a topic about water, we're going to limit how we do our research because we're thinking about usable water. We could protect water for the sake of other things that weren't resources, but that would be outside of the bounds of this topic. And I also put this little, like the circle, it's outside of the circle of all water because as you all will see when we get to the next slide, water resources, like sometimes it borders, like they have part to do with water and part to do with like land. So there could be water resources that interact with the water, but they're not all encompassed within the water. So I want to switch over to a brainstorming app because I want to get your all's opinions on like brainstorming advantage areas. So if we're thinking about water resources and water resources are, you know, they help us satisfy our needs and wants, and we can draw upon them when needed. Obviously, this topic is setting us up to have good affirmative advantage ground if we protect water resources. Like resources benefit us, and this topic is set up to protect those water resources. So let me switch my screen share if I can figure out how to. All right, so this is just a little brainstorming app, but I just want you all, let me see if I can pull up the chat. You can pop it in the chat or people can just, you know, raise your hand or you can just say it out loud. But if you say it out loud, it might be hard if two people talk at the same time. That's okay, we'll figure it out. What are some reasons that humans need water? And specifically, I also put like, how do we use bodies of water? Because there might be stuff inside the water that I want to think about too. Like, it's not just the water, like this topic isn't just about using water. It's also like what's inside the water, what's in those bodies of water that matter. Okay, good. We use water for drinking. We use water for, I'm going to put drinking and bathing both under consumption, right? So drinking, bathing, cleaning. Yeah, exactly. So, bathing, cleaning, not just cleaning ourselves, but you know, like the medical industry, for example, I'll just put a spin off of that. Like, maybe we should keep it here because like, how cleanly would our medical industry, for example, like hospitals be if we didn't have running water, for example? So sanitation, watering flowers, right? So we'll put consumption or feeding plants and animals. Right, so growing crops is a good example. We I mean, obviously we use rain to grow crops, but sometimes we need artificial, we need stored water in order to. It's hard to do this, like spinning it off. It's okay. I'm just gonna put them all in one place for now. Yeah, cleaning, sanitation of cars. We're in the auto industry, so cleaning cars is important around here. But also cleaning, we'll just leave it at sanitation. That can go cars, medical, all that stuff. Infrastructure, that's good. So let's break that down more. What do we mean by what are some examples of infrastructure? What kind of infrastructure do we put in water or on water or through water that we use to help ourselves? Dams, good. So dams are like human interventions that are made to like control where water goes and stays so that we can better use it. That's what a dam really is, or a bridge or harbor. Good.
Rivers and canals.
Good. All right, bridges, harbors. So harbors meaning like a port where boats can pull up, right? Sewage, good. That's another one that we definitely infrastructure, sewage and draining. So we can't have our water, our drinking water going through the same pipes that our sewage is going out of. A lot of us have been experiencing infrastructure problems recently because of all the flash floods in Detroit. My basement was under 6 feet of water and the city pumps failed and the sewage water was backing up into our regular water infrastructure, which has caused a whole host of problems. Good. So this is, you all are starting to get to why I sort of put that in that last picture, that water resources aren't all encompassed inside of water. Like when we talk about water resources, we're going to be talking about things in the water, but we're going to also be talking about like land-based concerns, because a lot of these things that are like inside of water or underneath the water, like we need to get in the water in order to get to these things. And so they're not, we don't intend for them to stay in the water, but we need to go in the water to get them out. For example, like oil, for example, sometimes we have to dig inland to get oil, but sometimes we have to dig through water, or we have to even create pipelines that go through sometimes land, sometimes water, in order to, just like we have pipelines for sewage and draining, we also have pipelines where we need to move oil or other types of, what other types of things would we need to move through? Wetlands. Okay, yeah, shipping. So shipping is important. We still rely on ships for global trade. We don't rely so much on ships for like immigration like we used to, for getting people to and from places. We rely more on planes for that now, but shipping is, or transportation is still done over like boat to some extent, but the majority of transportation that is happening through on the waters is for trade, for shipping goods. All right, good. So We have one response that wetlands can reduce the risk of flooding and capture greenhouse gases. So definitely regulating regulating the environment. I'll put that as a an element of how we use water resources. Like we might regulate the environment to preserve, for example, wetlands, so that we have a better chance of mitigating mitigating natural disasters and crises. Like, for example, how can we regulate the environment or our water resources to make sure that we can combat the effects of climate change? Or flooding associated with climate. So flooding, whether it's up for debate whether flooding is caused or not caused by climate change, like global warming. But even if it's just a natural disaster, like it's not caused by human induced, like flash flooding, for example, relatable example for us, a lot of us. Flash flooding may or may not be induced by like human climate change. It could just be like we've had flash floods through all of history, written history at least. Whether or not that's natural or sort of human accelerated crises, these natural sort of disasters are these threats that we want to protect ourselves from. So regulating the environment in order to mitigate these natural disasters or to solve some of these crises are a good example. And also, like, speaking of natural disasters, things like lead, it's not necessarily a natural disaster, but eliminating or preventing toxicity. So when lead pipes were created, like speaking of sewage and draining, lead pipes were not created with the intent to poison. It was a later scientific discovery that lead pipes, just like with asbestos, like later discoveries that these things that we've been using for as resources or in order to help us, gather and supply our water resources, that some of the chemicals in there are toxic, like lead. And so eliminating lead pipes, for example, having the infrastructure to replace some of these things are related, right? So like infrastructure is related to eliminating or preventing toxicity, but that's one reason that we would pay attention to or enact policy on water resources, is to eliminate or prevent toxicity, like toxic things that are in the water from affecting us, or even in our toxic elements in our water infrastructure. So one example would be like lead. Another would be like greenhouse, we'll just put GHG, greenhouse gases. I would recommend learning that acronym for debate, GHG, greenhouse gases, because we debate a lot about global warming, methane. This year, on this year's topic, it's not, I've noticed, because I coached, I did 7 weeks at University of Michigan debate camp before this, but I noticed that we're talking about a lot more than just CO2 this year. We're talking about methane, and we're talking about CO2, and we're talking about natural gas and some of these other toxic elements that could be in the water. So even over here, like we have, we start to see that we have some conflicting interests, like eliminating or preventing toxicity, but then we need oil, right? So we have oil spills, we have oil pipelines because it helps us get oil, but then those oil pipelines sometimes spill or there's accidents, and then we need to eliminate or prevent toxicity in the water. So even though we're brainstorming advantage areas, some of these like advantages or some of these protections are sort of at odds with each other. So some of them, even though we can think of these as things that the affirmative plan is trying to solve, the negative might end up spinning these as things that the AF, like in the AF trying to create new oil pipelines so that we can get access to oil, they might actually increase our chance of toxicity. Or if the AF is attempting to eliminate oil spills, that might actually trade off with our ability to get the most oil, so it depends on what you want to focus on. These are potential AF advantage areas, but not every AF will be about all of these things. These are just ideas for where different affirmatives. Darcel had mentioned that like the AF gets to decide where the debate starts, right? So if one of these look interesting to you, especially as varsity, if one of these, because with novice you have a controlled evidence packet, but if you're varsity and one of these sound interesting to you, that's like a potential area of research that you could develop an AF, or even see if there's, on the open evidence project, if there's already an AF that matches your research interest. All right, let's see, what am I not caught up on? Electric systems and communications networks, good. So I'm glad that I'm gonna put natural gas here too. Natural gas pipelines and we'll say pipelines and also fracking. I wish it was easier to like put these on here. There we go. Oil, pipelines, natural gas, fracking. We'll get to that at the end, natural gas and fracking, because that's what our packet F is. And then, good, so mining and drilling in the water is another thing that we do. So mining for resources, mining for other resources, right? So natural gas and oil could be an example of mining for other resources. There might also be like other resources that are in the water rather than being in land. So resource extraction. Also, okay, good, transportation. So shipping, we'll put transportation here. And transportation is maybe not so, like, again, commercial transportation isn't so important, but who uses the water to transport people around? Like, that it could be a matter of national security. Like, who navigates the waters in a way that is intended to protect our country, like our country's national security? Good, the Marines and the Navy, right? And even like the Coast Guard and stuff like that, or the yeah, the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard, the Marines, and the Navy are the three main agents of the U.S. military that patrol and regulate and navigate through the water. But using water resources as a form of navigation and also as, a way to protect, I guess, like we could call it homeland security, or protecting our water resources. Like, let's say we just didn't have any Navy around or any Coast Guard around our, the borders, or our even like if there's no military in our bodies of water, then potentially we could have foreign intervention in our bodies of water. Like if another nation wanted to go to war with us, they could invade via water. And if we didn't have like freedom of navigation or the ability to regulate and use that body of water, then we might be susceptible to like a water-based invasion of our homeland. Tourism, good. So water-based tourism, even like when I was saying transportation, like most people don't use like ships to immigrate anymore. Some people do use ships to immigrate. But also there's like commercial shipping, like commercial, what do they call it? Cruise lines. I don't know how like essential that those are to the economy, but there's definitely like evidence out there that tourism is key to the economy, and like water-based cities, like even Michigan, Pure Michigan, are commercials that taxpayer money goes towards, so that we could say like Pure Michigan, come out and see the Great Lakes. We have so much to offer. We get other people to come visit our state and do water-based activities, and that brings in revenues for our state. So it's not like taxpayer money is going into this Pure Michigan campaign just because we want bragging rights about the Great Lakes. Like, the Great Lakes are a resource that bring people in to our state. So good. Tourism. And then just trying to catch up on the chat. Electric systems and communication networks. I'm gonna put that down here by like energy, because a lot of people forget that like the internet, we think of it as just something that's like in the ether, but it requires infrastructure in order to make it. There's infrastructure in space and there's infrastructure underwater that makes the internet work. Communications networks, satellites, and internet. Like the internet has all these like underwater wirings that make it possible. Same thing with cable TV. It goes underwater, under land. And then we have, what about the use of water as a final living frontier other than space? Oh yeah, so water as a potential, so people say, what if the earth becomes inhabitable? Obviously, people like Elon Musk and some of these private companies are looking at the potential of getting people, quote, off the rock. But what if there's a potential that once climate change sort of like rises sea levels and we're living in a more water-based society, that is there a potential that we could like sort of colonize the water? So it is far-fetched in terms of Miss Love saying far-fetched in terms of like future speculation, but given the sort of history of how water's been used for colonization purposes, it's definitely being considered. And I don't know if it's in, I'm sure it's in the research for, we'll say, colonization for like future and earth inhabitability, but then also colonization, like conquest that we've already seen, like the United States federal government colonized, is a colonial nation, like settlers colonized this nation and established the United States. And without water resources, it would have never been possible. Like, we wouldn't have the United States federal government to speak of if it weren't for water resources and the ability to navigate water resources. So settlement to establish colonies or territories. Good. So that's one thing we haven't got at yet that's related to colonization too, is possession of water. So it's kind of funny when we think of like possession of water, because water is literally slippery. Like, it's hard to possess water. You have to possess something that holds the water in order to possess water. And even when we talk about like, you know, where does my water begin and where does your water end? So like the Detroit River, for example, if you look at a map, it's like part of it is ours and part of it is Canada's. Same thing with like like a lot of bodies of water are split between countries. A lot of bodies of water are even split between states or split between municipalities. So how do we define who possesses the water? we usually use, even though, like I said, like, oh, water's slippery. So you could say, I have this water, but on that side, it's always, it's always flowing into each other. But technically the way that we define it for usability purposes is like using longitude and latitude, just like, we do with land. So land is a little bit more stable. It does change over time, but we use longitude and latitude. And now we have GPS to sort of determine like, this is my part of the water. This is your part of the water. So, possession has to do with like rights of who gets to manage the water. So when we talk about like rights for even for example wetlands, like do we define those as bodies of water? How wet does the land need to be for it to be considered a body of water rather than a body of land? Some of these things, questions of definition. How do we define? This is why what you'll see affirmatives that are about questions of definition, because questions of definition directly relate to who gets to possess and who gets to regulate. Whoever possesses and has jurisdiction over that body of water gets to regulate it, has the jurisdiction to use it as a resource, right? Like what makes it ours to use as a resource? What makes the body of water the United States federal government, and what makes it within the United States federal government? And yep, isolating. Okay, yeah. So groups or species. So when we're talking about preserving marine environments, so again, because we're talking about water resources, this isn't an AF topic about saving. It's not like, oh, we can just have an AF about preserving the marine environment just for the sake of the marine environment. But if that marine environment ends up like being related to the water resources, like, so for example, fishing like is arguably a water resource. Like fish are a water resources because they're in water. So preserving a marine environment and making sure that like it's not overfished, for example, like regulations on fishing seasons or quotas on how much can be fished in that area or who can fish in that area, or if there's a permitting or licensing scheme in that area, might preserve the marine environment to make fishing possible, or to make like to preserve fishing resources. Or also ecosystems collapse. So arguably like we need to save species from ecosystems collapse, because ecosystems collapsing in the water could end up having like a domino effect and could end up influencing us, right? So if we think of the ecosystem of the water as a resource itself, because if the body of water became like an uninhabitable ecosystem, it would threaten us. That's another way to think of it. All right, and then I think that we've done a pretty good job, and I'll share the link to this with you all. But let me go back to my page or my PowerPoint presentation. And just summarize advantage areas or sort of subtopics of how water is used. There's possession, issues related to possession. So possessing bodies of water for regulation and control, and of possessing the resources within the boundaries of that water. So you can extract, like, for example, if there's oil and it's offshore, but it's within the United States territory, we can drill for oil. We can drill under the water for that oil if it's deemed that that's our territory. Navigation of water for transportation for people or goods. A lot of trade-based concerns. the global economy. I don't know if any of you all saw like over the beginning of the summer, maybe the spring, when that one shipping container from China like blocked the Suez Canal, and it like global trade was at a standstill for a few days, and it like shook the markets. And that's a really important global waterway. Without the Suez Canal, any shipping that has to go from like here to Asia would have to go underneath Africa up and around it. It couldn't go like through. And same thing with like the Great Lakes. Like I live near the Detroit River. I walk my dogs down there to the park where you can see like the Detroit River open up into Lake St. Clair. And so I always see these shipping containers that are bringing either stuff through Lake St. Clair that came from like, either Canada or overseas. And then it comes through Detroit using the lakes, Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and then goes off into Lake Huron, so there's a lot of shipping that, especially of our natural resources related to energy, that happens on the water. And then military or naval gain, like patrolling our waters for national security purposes, being able to have freedom of navigation, and also like putting other vessels through, above, or around water so that we can navigate around it. Like dams, for example, are a good example of infrastructure, but also like tunnels, bridges, pipelines, etc. And then finally, protection. So this encompasses a lot of what you all had thought of, like protecting ecosystems that provide this safe and clean water for us, because water is a fundamental human resource for life. Like not only do we need it for drinking, we need it for cooking, and we also need it in order to stay clean. So these are some of the basic needs of humans. And like living in Michigan, we actually are privileged in that sense of having one of the best sources of fresh water in the world. And so like our tap water that we drink in Detroit is better than the majority of even bottled water that you'll drink. Like it's just as good as a lot of the bottled water that's coming from other fresh water sources. And so water is obviously a really important, protecting the water is important to just basic life concerns, but then also preventing loss, like preventing natural catastrophes, weather, crisis management. Like look what happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, and the levees broke, and the infrastructure still hasn't been repaired to the extent that it would be needed to prevent that same type of loss if something like a hurricane happened again. Or protecting us from damage done by current infrastructure. So if you all, once you all get into this topic more and start seeing debates, there's a debate about whether or not dams are actually like a relic of the past that we just need to do away with, or if we should invest in fixing our dams. So we might actually, it turns out that some infrastructure projects, there's advantages to them, but down the road there's disadvantages. Like we're seeing that dams are interfering with ecosystems, for example. So we might want to tinker with the existing infrastructure that's potentially threatening and causing harms. And then these other resources that are protected inside the water, like oil, natural gas, the internet, food sources, other natural resources that we might need to get into the water to extract. So those are sort of just an overview of what types of advantages we'll be debating about. But there will be, this is just our preliminary list. I'm sure there's some that we haven't thought of as well. And then I have a slide saved at the end to introduce you to fracking, which is the app that we're going to go with for the packet for this camp tournament. All right, and then the next set of And I will post the PowerPoint for you all, the video and the PowerPoint. So, and I'll post the link to that brainstorming web too. So the second thing that I want to look at, the second sort of limiting term of art, the first was water resources. Now I want to look at in the US. And the reason that I explicitly did not reply to the last comment made by, I think it was Victoria. Oh wait, by Nia. Is it Nia or Naya? That about the
It's
ocean.
Naya.
Naya,
I'm
okay,
sorry. Yes, Naya.
okay, cool. That Naya had made a comment, we've only discovered about 5 to 10% of the ocean. So maybe there's some more marine life and deadly bacteria found in the water that we don't know about. So that's a good point, that there's definitely deadly bacteria and other toxic bacteria, or even, we didn't even talk about viruses, right? So the coronavirus is an airborne virus, but there could be waterborne viruses that we need to protect against. So protecting against bacteria, viruses, strains of toxicity in our water is definitely an important advantage area. But I also wanted to save this comment because whether or not this topic is about the oceans is also something that's important to talk about. So what is the waters of the United States? So going back to my original diagram, we have all water, which is, we're not debating about anything related to the water. We're talking specifically about water resources. But even then, we're not talking about all water resources in the world. Like, we're only talking about water resources in the United States. So we have to pay attention to what in the United States means. So if we're thinking about the ocean, not all of the ocean is within the territorial boundaries of the United States, but some of it is. And we have to think about, is the part of the ocean that's territorializing like the United States, is that part of the waters of the United States or not? It's going to be up for debate. But in a sense, this topic is limited by geography, like the combination of geography, which is a natural thing, and nation state borders, which is like sort of a human imposition of, this is our nation, this is the land that our nation is. And so the nation state borders, like the borders of the United States, are important to this topic, because what is in the United States is the boundaries of the topic. If now that we if you had an AF that you read about, with the recent Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, if you were reading about it and it said like, oh, the Taliban water resources are going to be limited or something, and you'd be like, oh, I could write an AF about helping people in Afghanistan get their water resources. No, because it's not that that's not interesting, but it's not in the United States, right? So water resource, it's another way of limiting the topic. The topic would just be too huge if we had to talk about like all people's water resources or all the water resources, because like enacting policies about what water resources that are already sort of part of our territory is a whole different ball game than water aid or water assistance to another country. Like water aid or water assistance would be done by like the executive branch, the State Department, whereas like water policies here would be done by like the EPA or the Congress, right? So or localities. So we have to put a limit on how we think about regulating water resources so that we can concentrate on the methods of regulating our own water resources, basically. So essentially, affirmatives have to be like, if you're the affirmative, you will defend a plan that is about water resources in the United States, which means that protecting any water outside the bounds of the US would be out of bounds of your burden of proof, or like your sort of what you came to debate about, which would mean it's untopical to debate about, for example, going out into like the middle of the Pacific Ocean and trying to go super far down deeper than we've been before to try to find like bacteria to that we can guard ourselves against, you know? So even though that is an example of using water resources, since it's not in the United States, that would be outside the bounds of the topic. And so I wanted to give a little sneak peek at an argument you might see. This is in the form of a topicality shell. So Darcel had talked yesterday about topicality, or like defining, using cards and research to define what the topic is. So this was taken from the University of Michigan Camp Starter Pack. I included a link for, for that at the bottom. It's also linked on our website, but this is just a topicality shell that would be read against an AF if the AF said that they target the water outside of the US in the ocean. So there's a general consensus that this topic is about fresh water. So if you look at this example down here, so the second card, the Crawford and 17 card, this would be the tag. The EEZ is not part of the United States. EEZ is the extended economic zone. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, but it's sort of, it was a regulation that sort of defends that 200 miles outside of the border of the United States, and like from where the land transitions to ocean and then 200 miles out is sort of like the territory of the United States. And we have exclusive, it's our quote exclusive economic zone. And so that sort of defines that 200 mile border, or is it 200 miles or 200 kilometers? I forget. From all of the, 200 nautical miles from the baseline. That's sort of our territory. So part of the waters of the US is arguably, I'll go to the slide ahead. Like all of this blue, this dark blue around these territories of water would be extensions of nations and land's territory based on this 200 nautical mile concept. So if like this part would be the United States, this part would be Canada, this part would be United States because it's Alaska, even like this is part of the reason that the US still holds on to some of its colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, the US Virgin Islands, because we get, by having Puerto Rico, Guam as our colonies and as technically part of the United States, we get access to the waters around those islands, and they become our outside borders, are sort of like water borders. So the EEZ is, it came from the Reagan era. Reagan was the one who proclaimed that the EEZ was the exclusive economic zone. And this sort of set a global norm where everyone considers that 200 nautical miles to be sort of like their exclusive zone. But it's not, according to this evidence, officially incorporated into the territory of the United States. Now, because it's like up for debate, there will be some people who say, no, actually, even though it's the outside border, it's still the waters of the United States. But they will agree that, anything that's in this light blue area, this is not the waters of any one particular country. This is just, I forget what they call it, but it's like open waters. It doesn't belong to anyone. And then, so if you look at this top one, here we have, this is the tag, this is the site, and this is the actual card. So this, the EEZ extends from 12 to 200 nautical miles from baseline, going all the way to the US, has not been incorporated into the territory of the US. For those beginners, I'm just trying to help you like navigate what I'm actually reading. This is the card. This would be the actual text, like the quote that came from this Crawford article. And this Cynthia Crawford person is a senior counsel at the Cause of Action Institute, and this was the article that it came from. So then this next top card says, which you would technically read first, but I just wanted to introduce that one first. that water resources are distinct from the oceans because like water resources are natural fresh water and the oceans are salt water. Water resources are water found in fresh and brackish surface water and groundwater bodies within the national territory. The water of the oceans and the open seas is excluded on the grounds that its volumes are so enormous to make any stock measure meaningless and the extraction for humans have no measurable impact. So basically there is a strong sort of opinion that when we're talking about this topic, we're not talking about these blue lines. We're not talking about our outside borders of water, like the water that borders the outside of the United States. What we're talking about is the water inside of the United States. And that would include, for example, the Great Lakes. As you can see, the Great Lakes is a clear example of water that's inside of the United States. But even like, I think Lake Superior, part of that belongs to Canada. And then I included a hyperlink to this lecture of waters of the United States, because one point that I wanted to make with this last image is that like you could say that there's a clear boundary between waters outside the United States and waters inside the United States, but that is a blurred watery boundary at best, you know what I mean? Because we're talking about water. So it's hard to like, even if you think about, look at this this map. I don't know if any of you have like even open up a map of the East Coast. Like, I don't know if any of you have been to North Carolina or anything like that, or even out east towards like Connecticut or New Hampshire, some of these that have like the bays on the east side. It's like, if you look at this picture here, the ocean like crawls up to these like to this land, but then there's like water in between the land and moorland, which we call like the bay. But oftentimes there's like spillage between the fresh water and the ocean water. So like it's hard to sometimes draw the boundary between where inside the US and outside the US exists when we're talking about water, because like waterways are open to each other. And like the wetlands example, right? Like how wet does the land have to be before you consider it a body of water versus a body of land? And especially with climate change, rising sea levels, etc. And this isn't anything new. Like climate, you all have seen the map of how like the earth changed from Pangea to what it is now, and how like things keep moving around throughout time. Like even before humans, shores eroded and emerged, you know. So drawing borders around bodies of water is a slippery endeavor. And so some of the apps like JL had JL had mentioned yesterday in his initial lecture, the WOTUS, the waters of the United States, and whether or not we consider, for example, there's recent rulings that are being contested on whether or not wetlands are included or not. But there's these questions of definition of how we define waters of the United States, and those questions of definition are potentially parts of the topic. Like there might be not only debates and topicality about how we define, but actually affirmatives about how we need to redefine what the waters of the United States are so that we can protect them more. So if we define more things as the waters of the United States, then we can protect those things as the waters of the United States. So essentially, the thing that you should take away is the majority of this topic is going to be about fresh bodies of water inside the borders of the United States. There might be some apps that try to claim that that apps that do stuff in the ocean directly, that's within the territory of the EEZ is topical because this is a body of water, but the bulk of your debates are going to be about bodies of fresh water that are within inside the United States. And then the last term of art that I want to look at is its protection of water resources in the United States. So increasing the United States federal government should increase its protection of water resources is what you have to defend. So increasing protection is the main action of the resolution. This is like the main verb. If you think of like the main actor agent of the resolution is the United States federal government, the main thing that it is doing is increasing its protection. But also protecting resources is an end goal for AF solvency. So you can't just stand up in fiat and say like, resolve, the United States federal government will protect resources. Like it can't just be that generic, where you're saying like the AF is just gonna fiat that we protect all water resources, right? Because policy debate is supposed to mirror like the skills and the importances of needing to make policy in real life. And we can't just be like, wouldn't it be great if all the water was protected, but we didn't talk about how we would protect it, you know, like we need to get from point A to point B in terms of actually protecting those resources. We need a method. So the solvency needs to be up for debate. It can't just be like the AF is protect all water resources and the only neg ground is, you know what, it would be horrible to protect water resources. Water, you know, we don't need water. The negative would never be able to win if it was just like, should water resources be protected? Yes or no, right? So the debate would be lopsided if it was just like, should water resources be protected? Because like, as we can see, the definition of water resources itself are like things that are useful. So obviously it helps to protect things that we need to use or that we need or want, but protection is a specific like action that policymakers can take. It requires procedures and regulation. It's not just something that we can like wish that happens by saying the word protect. So we can't just fiat solvency and say like, and this gets to the question and the interaction that Darcel had with one of the students yesterday about like, how much does fiat really give you? So fiat can give you the path, like that you get to pretend a plan passes, that the United States federal government passes a plan, but you don't just get to say like, we guarantee that all water resources will ultimately be protected at any cost. Like there's no way that you can argue against our solvency. So that's one thing. It's like, even though protection, we think of protection as sort of an end goal, like, oh, I succeeded at protecting her from the, you know, scary camp counselor or something, right? So protection is something that you can secure for yourself, but it's also something like a method that you can enact, and it may or may not actually do the job, right? So I could hire private security to protect me, but depending on what kind of private security I hired, they may or may not actually protect me, if that makes sense. So you don't just get to be like, the AF is whether or not it would be a great idea in theory to protect. You have to propose a certain like method to protect the water resources. So you need to connect the dots. How does the AF's method or plan to protect the ocean or to protect the water actually solve for the harms that is currently being done to these water resources? So you have to have a method of protection, and then you use like inherency and harms to say that there's a current threat, to our water resources. And then the plan is like, what is your plan for protecting them? And your solvency is like, how does that plan actually work? Because putting a plan for protection doesn't always mean that you're going to be protected. That's how protection kind of works. Its protection means that the agent of the plan and the protection has to be the United States federal government. So it needs to be the United States federal government protecting the water. It can't just be like the United States federal government will mandate that every individual household in America like protect its own water. It has to be the United States federal government protecting its water. It has to be United States federal government policy. And then even thinking about the word protection, back to like, it ties back to this idea of resources, that there, in order to protect something, there's this sort of presumed protect from whom or protect from what. There's external threats present, and those external threats might be natural, like not, you know, even if humans never existed, those things would exist. Or they could be human caused or human accelerated threats like global warming. Maybe global warming would exist if it weren't for people, but it definitely wouldn't be at this accelerated point if it weren't for, you know, the auto industry and greenhouse gases and industrialization and all that stuff. And then, so basically there's just threats, and protection is meant to protect from. It's not, and there's a, in the literature, there's a distinction between protection and preservation. So again, because this is about water resources, it's about protecting our water resources from harm, not just preserving ocean or marine ecosystems just for the sake of preserving them. So to summarize, a topical plan will propose that the United States federal government should implement a policy that enacts a specific method of protection, a specific method for safeguarding water resources from harm. I should have put from harm at the end. But basically, does that make sense? It's a policy. It usually is going to be like a regulation, a scheme of, you know, some sort of protection that requires different agencies to invest resources or to regulate industries that are operating on or in our water resources. So a topical plan will propose and has the burden of proof that the United States federal government will implement a specific policy that will safeguard water resources from harm. So you'll have, you know, before you read your plan or before the plan is read, there will be an outlining of like what resources are at harm, are in jeopardy, what resources are threatened. And then there will be a specific plan that's proposing what type of policy and action or regulatory scheme could be implemented in order to solve and check back and safeguard the water resources against that harm. Does that make sense? So that's sort of how the topic at the AF debates, how when Darcel said the AF sets the tone of what the debate will be about. In a sense, the resolution and the people who created this resolution, the debate coaches, the whole group of debate coaches in the country that get together, and actually JL has been a part of this topic process selection several of the past years, but they are the ones who sort of initially decide what the debates will be about. But then within that topic, the affirmative gets to decide what specific threats and harms and what specific plan they are going to enact and what, you know, what that will solve for. So not everybody's AF will, even though everybody's AF will defend the resolution, not, I'll just really quickly switch back over to not everybody's AF will be about all of these things. You know what I mean? Like nobody has time in 8 minutes to talk about all of these things. So different AFs will focus on different things. Like some AFs might focus on navigation for military reasons. Some AFs might focus on eliminating or preventing toxicity like lead or even bacterial or viral toxicities. Or some might focus on actually increasing access to energy, whereas some might focus on actually preserve, limiting like energy companies from using or extracting from our natural resources, because that process of extracting energy might actually be causing harm in other ways, right? So some of these advantage areas could also potentially be disadvantage areas in the future, because like the example I gave before, which is like one AF might say that we should stop allowing energy companies to extract because that's going to cause like natural disasters and harm our environment and make it so toxic that it's not worth it. Some apps might actually say we need to increase drilling and increase access to these pipelines because we need it for our economy. We need it for our industries, right? So this is a perfect transition into my last slide, which is the spot. Oh, let me go back to my last slide. The spotlight on hydraulic fracturing is the technical term for it, hydraulic fracturing. The other, what we call it for short is fracking. And the affirmative that we put in the packet is limiting hydraulic fracking. Like, I think I don't know if it completely eliminates it, but it severely limits hydraulic fracking because of the supposed harm that fracking is causing to the environment. But there's plenty of debates that's like fracking is important for our economy. So you'll see as this topic unfolds, like if you look at our packet, we have the fracking F and the fracking neg, but then we also have the economy disadvantage, right? So fracking might cause some environmental problems, but it also is helping our economy. So what do you do when the environment and the economy are at odds with each other? That's one of the main pressing questions of a policy maker these days, is like, what about when the environment and the economy are at odds with each other? Or what about when the economy and human rights are at odds with each other? Like, which one do we focus on? Which one is more important? And that will be the center of a lot of the debates that you'll have as a policy debater too, of like, where do we prioritize our policies? What's more important? Protecting from what threats? Like the threat of not having enough oil, is that a threat? Or is it the threat of what oil or what natural gas will do to our environment, of what fracking will do to our environment, for example? So instead of me introducing this topic of fracking, because I'm not good at explaining like the mechanics of it, but I found this, I think it's like a 5-minute video that's explaining just the basics of what fracking is, and then outlining the basic, is this an opportunity or is it a danger? And I'll put the and/or, because it's an opportunity and a danger. But in debate, we weigh the advantages and disadvantages, and we say, do the advantages of fracking outweigh the disadvantages? The affirmative would say we should put an end to fracking because the disadvantages of fracking are bigger than the advantages of fracking. But the negative might say, no, we need fracking, So let me play this video, and then I'll give you a break. This new Zoom update is killing me with, it's like hiding my Zoom bar.
What is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking? Since the Industrial Revolution, our energy consumption has risen unceasingly. The majority of this energy consumption is supplied by fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about a controversial method of extracting natural gas, hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Put simply, fracking describes the recovery of natural gas from deep layers inside the earth. In this method, porous rock is fractured by the use of water, sand and chemicals in order to release the enclosed natural gas. The technique of fracking has been known since the 1940s. Nonetheless, only in the last 10 years has there been quite a fracking boom, especially in the USA. This is because most conventional natural gas sources in America and on the European continent have been exhausted. Thus, prices for natural gas and other fuels are rising steadily. Significantly more complicated and expensive methods, like fracking, have now become attractive and profitable. In the meantime, fracking has already been used more than 1 million times in the USA alone. Over 60% of all new oil and gas wells are drilled by using fracking. Now, let's take a look at how fracking actually works. First, a shaft is drilled several hundred meters into the earth. From there, a horizontal hole is drilled into the gas-bearing layer of rock. Next, the fracking fluid is pumped into the ground using high-performance pumps. On average, the fluid consists of 8 million liters of water, which amounts to about the daily consumption of 65,000 people, plus several thousand tons of sand and about 200,000 liters of chemicals. The mixture penetrates into the rock layer and produces innumerable tiny cracks. The sand prevents the cracks from closing again. The chemicals perform various tasks. Among other things, they compress the water, kill off bacteria, or dissolve minerals. Next, the majority of the fracking fluid is pumped out again. And now the natural gas can be recovered. As soon as the gas source is exhausted, the drill hole is sealed. As a rule, the fracking fluid is pumped back into deep underground layers and sealed in there. However, fracking is also associated with several considerable risks. The primary risk consists in the contamination of drinking water sources. Fracking not only consumes large quantities of fresh water, but in addition the water is subsequently contaminated and is highly toxic. The contamination is so severe that the water cannot even be cleaned in a treatment plant. Even though the danger is known and theoretically could be managed, in the USA already sources have been contaminated due to negligence. No one yet knows how the enclosed water will behave in the future, since there have not yet been any long-term studies on the subject. The chemicals used in fracking vary from the hazardous to the extremely toxic and carcinogenic, such as benzol or formic acid. The companies using fracking say nothing about the precise composition of the chemical mixture. But it is known that there are about 700 different chemical agents which can be used in the process. Another risk is the release of greenhouse gases. The natural gas recovered by fracking consists largely of methane, a greenhouse gas which is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Natural gas is less harmful than coal when burned. But nonetheless, the negative effects of fracking on the climate balance are overall greater. Firstly, the fracking process requires a very large consumption of energy. Secondly, the drill holes are quickly exhausted, and it's necessary to drill fracking holes much more frequently than for classical natural gas wells. In addition, about 3% of the recovered gas is lost in the extraction and escapes into the atmosphere. So how is fracking and its expected benefits to be assessed when the advantages are balanced against the disadvantages? When properly employed, this technique offers one way in the short to medium term to meet our demand for lower-cost energy. But the long-term consequences of fracking are unforeseeable, and the risk to our drinking water thus should not be underestimated.
All right, so I thought that that was a good just overview of what is fracking, how it works, and why we do it. Like, what are the potential advantages? Like, there's a reason that we risk the harm done to the environment, because natural gas has benefits, right? So those benefits are potentially in jeopardy if we limit fracturing, which is why that makes this a good debate, which is why we chose this for the packet, because there's good substantive case arguments for why we need fracking, and there's good arguments for why we need to limit fracking, and we can't have the best of both worlds. We have to choose fracking, or, you know, increase fracking to get natural gas, or limit fracking, limiting our natural gas supply, but potentially protecting from these environmental based harms. So
What is hydraulic fracturing?
the on-case files on our website, the fracking AF and CaseNeg. Feel free to take a look at these during the break if, you know, if you wanted something to, like, something tangible to look at in terms of evidence. I would start there with the fracking affirmative and CaseNeg. The link to our Google Drive, just real quick, I had already put this up, but our Google Drive, you can find the link on our website that has like our evidence. But this is not the right version. This is the edited version. But we do have like the evidence available for you on our page, but we're gonna keep adding evidence to the drive. So with the novice packet, we'll make sure to include links, but the drive itself is like a Google Drive folder that I've shared with you all, and it's divided into like on case. So right now we have the fracking AF and CaseNeg. We will put another AF and CaseNeg on there for the novices before the season starts, but this will be the AF and NEG that we just use for the Saturday tournament. Just to control prep. It's already enough to prepare for one AF. We want to give you all the option to have, and we're going to have a native rights AF that we put up there going into the season. So you have the choice of 2 different AFs if you're novice. But for now, we're just going to practice on that one AF just so that we can get, you know, form and content down. And then we have off case. We have the 3 negative positions. Darcel had sort of overviewed these positions. The counterplan, DA, and critique. And then these are negative positions, and there's corresponding AF answers to all of them in our drive. So that will be the sort of packet that we're going to go off of for the tournament and for evidence. The varsity kids might end up adding stuff to theirs, but for the rest of the students, we'll just use this. This will be the evidence that we'll use for Saturday's tournament. So you can never start familiarizing yourself with this evidence too early. So even if your lab leaders don't have you pull up the evidence and start working with it directly today, that it's available here, and just know that this is the evidence that people will be reading out of. These are this is sort of the content that we're going to go with for now. So it won't catch you by surprise on Saturday when people read from these files. So these files are examples of topic files. There's a ton of topic files. Again, we had put the link to the NDC Open Evidence Project, and this basically just has all the all the files that were put out by like every camp that have been accumulated. And so there's usually not like, we shouldn't have lack of evidence be a problem in the league.